I am going to turn it over to Amy Smith, who I have the great pleasure of knowing and being in community with a number of projects, and specifically art equity. Over to you, Amy. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Kate. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. Really looking forward to our conversation today. I'm Amy Smith. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a dance and theater artist, educator, and facilitator, calling in from just outside of Sakimauchin in Philadelphia, Lenapehoking. I wear many hats in the artist community, including doing tax preparation for artists and giving one-on-one financial advice to artists, and teaching financial wellness, financial literacy through Creative Capital and Assets for Artists, and at a bunch of other organizations. So I'm really excited to share some information and resources and strategies with you all today. As Kate said, please don't hesitate to ask a clarifying question in the chat, and I might even have Kate pause me for a moment if something needs clarification, like if I'm using lingo or if I'm just talking too fast. Don't be shy about pausing me for that. And then at the end, we'll have time for more substantive questions after I talk about financial health in the time of COVID, how we should be getting paid and paying our teams, self-employment and entity types, and moving away from scarcity mindset. So that said, I want to just invite you to, I know that talking about money is hard, and especially in a time of global pandemic and financial precarity for a lot of folks, and all kinds of other kinds of precarity. So I just want to invite you to be as present as you want to be and can be in this space. I like seeing video, I like seeing faces, but I invite you to turn video off if that helps you be more present and available to this conversation. I invite you to breathe and notice your breath, and just notice if you're holding tension and try to release that tension. I invite you to practice self-care as we're talking about these topics. And certainly towards the end, if you're asking a specific question about something that is going on for you financially, because it's being recorded, just be mindful not to reveal anything confidential or too personal to you. So let us begin by talking about financial health in the time of COVID. I want to start all of this by saying you are not alone. A lot of us feel embarrassed to talk about financial vulnerability because neoliberal capitalism tells us that we should be climbing a ladder toward financial success, and that our success and failures are indicative of our individual strength or weakness. So I want to just be really clear and say, if you are in debt, your debt is not shameful. Your financial reality is not shameful, and it is not of your making. The system that we are existing in, neoliberal capitalism, racial capitalism, is designed to funnel wealth towards the owning class, and it is working exactly as it was designed. Capitalism, patriarchy, colonialism, white supremacy are all working together to ensure this flow of wealth into the hands of white people in the owning class. So there's no amount of individual knowledge or strength or perseverance that can guarantee upward mobility, and the system is in fact designed to prevent upward mobility. But I believe also that we can share resources and form coalitions so that we can achieve more personal and family and community well-being, financial well-being. And I also hope, I'm eternally optimistic, that this pandemic can move us closer to more humane policies from our government and more robust structures of mutual aid. I have a cat in my room, so I'm sorry if it's a little noisy. She keeps batting around. Okay, sorry about that. Come on up, kitty. There's some really deep stuff that's getting in the way of our financial well-being beyond the structural oppression, and one of those is scarcity mentality. So scarcity mentality is zero-sum thinking. It's the belief that there will never be enough. It's short-term thinking over long-term thinking. It's hoarding. And if we can learn to recognize the patterns of scarcity mentality in ourselves and others, we can start to move towards healthier attitudes about money and finances and more collective power. And because we're in a time of crisis, COVID crisis, and so many overlapping crises right now, I think it's hard for us to imagine moving towards abundance thinking. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but I do think we need to be asking what is enough and making sure that we share resources in our communities like this one so that everyone has enough and can survive together. There have been some really great resource sharing and mutual aid mapping and solidarity economy structures being created or revitalized in some cases as a result of the pandemic. One of the slides you were showing as you opened up was the COVID-19 freelance artist resource guide. There have been a bunch of artist relief funds. And some of these relief funds are working really well, and some artists were able to access unemployment benefits for the first time as a result of the CARES Act. And the federal government has shown us that we can print money to help people if we want to. So that was that was an important piece of news as a result of the pandemic, is that we have demonstrated that we can in fact support folks through financial precarity in this time. And we always had the ability to do it. We just opted not to as a society. But the pandemic has also widened a lot of the inequities that already existed in our society and that have existed for decades. So one of those inequities is the credit system. So I want to start, when we talk about credit scores and credit in general, I always like to start by saying you are not your credit score. This is something that a lot of artists have internalized or have a kind of like downward spiral of negative thinking about associating themselves with their credit score and having negative credit or poor credit or bad credit. But like we've just been talking about, the credit system and banking institutions in general were built on a legacy of racism and discrimination, and the structures as they are now are perpetuating this history every day. And yet we still internalize this message that poor credit or bad credit is because we're a bad person or a weak person or we made bad choices. Your value as a person and an artist and a designer has nothing to do with this number, which is just a shorthand way for lenders to talk to each other about your perceived credit worthiness. And during the pandemic, everyone's credit is going to suffer. So the loss of income, the unemployment, needing to use credit cards to pay for basic needs, all of that's going to have a negative impact on everyone in our society. So I would just encourage you not to spend any precious emotional energy worried about your credit. Put that in the bucket of things that you're going to think about after the immediate crisis of the pandemic has passed. That said, there are some things that will be helpful or prudent in terms of credit right now. So if you have a credit card, you can call them and ask them to lower your rate right now. And they're often really willing to do that without barely a conversation about it. Or see if you can get one of those cards that has a 0% rate for 6 months and transfer balances over to take advantage of that to pay down cards with higher APRs. If you own a home, you can take advantage of these historically low interest rates and the mortgage pause that many mortgage lenders are offering. You can get a home equity loan or refinance your mortgage to pay down other kinds of debt like credit card debt or even student loan debt. If you have student loan debt, you're already signed up for this automatic pause with your federal loans. But once those start up again in the fall, ask for a deferment or sign up for income-based repayment if you're not already signed up for that program or debt consolidation. Another thing that a lot of artists have been doing are getting these SBA Small Business Association loans. The first one was well, they both came out at the same time. The PPP loan was the Paycheck Protection Loan was really geared towards people with payroll. So many artists weren't applying for or receiving that loan. It was it could be used for compensation replacement, but it just felt tricky, and it was a little bit tricky to wrap your head around that. So more of the artists that I know applied for the EIDL, which I think stands for Economic Injury Disaster Loan. I'm not 100% sure. But that's a loan that has a 3.75% rate, and it has a 30-year term. So it's very cheap money, and you're eligible for it if you filed a Schedule C last year, which most artists do. And this is the kind of cheap loan with good terms that wealthy people have access to all the time, but lower income folks rarely do. So take advantage of that if you can. Another thing I want to underline is this idea that all debt is negotiable. And this is another thing that wealthy people know, including our president, who often doesn't pay his bills and basically just negotiates down and gets people to write off bad debt. Just because he does it doesn't mean it's bad. I mean, it is bad for him to do it, but negotiating debt is something that people do all the time, and it's not something that only rich people should be doing, keeping them rich. Those of us who are middle income or lower income also need to know and understand that this is a common practice, and we too can have conversations with lenders and negotiate with them to write off bad debt, which is something that every company has in their budget for the year, especially credit card companies, but even hospitals and even the IRS, certainly student loan lenders, all have a bad debt write-off line in their budget because they know that they will be writing off a certain amount of debt every year. So really talk to your lenders is the tip or strategy there. I know that there's often a hurdle that taking that first step and calling the first time is often really hard. But if you can muster the energy and know that you have to be persistent sometimes and call several times to get the desired effect, I would just encourage you to call folks to whom you owe money and see if you can negotiate a better term, or for them to write off some of that debt, especially because of the pandemic. Just say, look, I'm a designer, I lost a bunch of income. What can you do for me? And then build power by banding together. This is something that has happened more in our society since the Occupy movement, I would say, as far as debtors, people who are borrowers, banding together. First, there was the Jubilee movement where, again, this came out of the Occupy movement, where folks were buying up bad debt from collection agencies and then just discharging it, basically at pennies on the dollar, and then just ripping it up and saying, you're free, you don't have to pay that old debt anymore. And that turned into, there's an organization called the Debt Collective that's doing really great work around creating people power among borrowers, and again, kind of dismantling this internalized sense that a lot of folks have that being in debt means you're a bad person. They have a lot of information on their website about how to respond to collection agencies and other folks that are harassing you about debt, illegally often. And when it comes to debt and negotiating with lenders, I think of a kind of a three-pronged approach. The first prong is doing it yourself. So just picking up the phone and calling the credit card company, or I might have to get rid of this cat, the credit card company, or the taxing agency, or hospital, or whoever you owe money to, and talking to them, sometimes repeatedly, and getting them to write off some debt or negotiate terms for you. The second prong is to get help from a nonprofit. Just going to say that again, nonprofit, because there are some scammers that pretend to be debt consolidation agencies and are not. So make sure whoever you're talking to is a nonprofit debt consolidation agency. One that I've recommended before is nfcc.org, but there are loads out there and a lot of local resources you can look up from service orgs, et cetera. So that's number two, where someone who's very knowledgeable about negotiating debt on your behalf will do it for you and with you. And then the third prong, I am gonna have to get rid of this cat. The third prong is to declare bankruptcy. And again, I just want to say there is no shame in bankruptcy. It is a very reasonable and prudent thing to do if you're carrying a lot of debt. I have a friend a dance artist who declared bankruptcy a couple years ago, and now she just tells everybody she knows how great it is because she got rid of a bunch of credit card debt. She feels so much lighter. It's so much easier on her heart and soul. She's not carrying around this burden of debt. That's what it's there for. All right. How should we be getting paid and paying our support teams? So I want to talk a little bit about the difference between W-2 or wage income and 1099 or independent contractor income. I'm sure most of you know this, so it'll be a review, but just to be really clear, because from the IRS's point of view and from other entities' point of view, it is an important distinction, whether you're being paid as an employee or an independent contractor. So wage income means that the payer is withholding taxes on your behalf and sending them to the IRS or Social Security, Medicare, state, even the city. And what you get, your check is your take-home pay after those withholdings have been done. A 1099, you just get your flat fee and you're responsible for paying all of the payroll taxes on it, meaning 15.3% of Social Security and Medicare, self-employment tax essentially, and whatever federal and state taxes you owe on the net profit on your Schedule C. There's a form at irs.gov that I always encourage people to take a look at when we get into conversations about how to characterize or whether one should be characterized as an employee or independent contractor. The form SS8 is a form that basically just asks a series of questions about the relationship between the person paying and the payee. And those questions are things like, who sets the schedule? Does it have to be the person you hired doing the work, or could someone else do it? Like, could they hire a subcontractor, essentially? Whose equipment is used? Where is the work done? So there's just a bunch of questions that help determine that characterization question. It is a gray area, and there will always be a gray area because it's not, especially in theater, it's often not 100% clear whether someone should be characterized as an employee or an independent contractor. But oftentimes employers have an incentive to mischaracterize you as an independent contractor so that they can avoid paying the payroll taxes on your labor, and also avoid paying for any benefits, unemployment compensation, workers' comp, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sure most of you have heard there's a new law in California that passed last year that basically says no one's an independent contractor in that state, which has wreaked a lot of havoc in the theater community, as you can imagine. And I feel that law sort of drifting towards us here on myself on the East Coast. And I think also the pandemic is kind of shifting people's thinking about characterization, and I think leaning more of us towards wanting to correctly characterize people, arts workers, as employees when they should rightfully be considered and characterized that way. So that's just sort of like the trend, or what I feel is in the air. And also because of the pandemic, a new awareness of the importance of employment in the form of unemployment compensation being linked to employment. And Kate, I see your hand.
Yes, I would love to ask a clarifying question,
Yeah.
Amy, and just like very clearly spell it out. Should theaters be hiring designers as contractors or as W-2 employees? And this is just so you know, for our context, this is a long conversation with our union 829 and the theaters, and part of constant bargaining.
Yeah. Oh, it's so hard. In my years running a nonprofit dance company, I always paid designers as independent contractors, partially because thinking about the questions on the SS8, it was bound in time. You know, it was a specific time period, maybe a few weeks or a month. If they couldn't do it and had to bring in someone else to do it for them, that was acceptable. They were often using their own equipment in the form of, you know, their own software and laptop and et cetera, not in terms of lighting equipment, but creating the design. Yeah, I mean, I just don't know how to answer that question. I think there is an argument to be made that more designers should be on payroll, and especially when they're repeatedly working at the same theater. I'm thinking of an example of a friend of mine who has been working for 10 years at a Lord Theater in Sacramento, Philadelphia, and really should be on payroll and works, you know, like 2 or 3 shows a year. So that's an example of, I think it swings in that direction, but unfortunately, I just don't feel like there's a clear answer. I'm sorry. I wish, and we can get more into it at the end, like with specific examples, but yeah, it's a really tricky gray area realm. That said, I think the trend is going to be more towards putting people on payroll for the reasons I just mentioned. So let's talk a little bit about self-employment and entity types. So we were just talking about Schedule C filing, being a self-employed artist, self-employed designer, theater artist, filing Schedule C. One of the things that I noticed during the frenzy of people applying for the SBA loans, and I talked a lot of people through that process, was I realized how many people didn't know what kind of entity they were. So I just want to spell out what these different entity types are. And certainly as they get more complicated, there's more of a, I would describe it as like a burden of understanding, or it's important to just understand what it entails to choose an entity type other than sole proprietorship or self-employed, so that you're really well aware of the benefits and the challenges and the filing deadlines and what it means for your tax situation, et cetera. So this is just encouragement to self-educate around these issues as you're navigating them. So I'll go from simplest to most complex. Simplest is Schedule C filing, sole proprietorship, self-employed, independent contractor. My cat is really just having so many cameos here. Independent contractor. Again, this is most designers that I know are filing Schedule C. They're getting 1099s and they're reporting them, deducting expenses. Come on, Tina. Come on. There you go. Goodbye. They're filing Schedule C, deducting expenses, and then paying self-employment tax on the net profit, which is the income minus the expenses on Schedule C. The trick for a lot of designers that I have worked with as clients or know as friends is that if the bulk of your income from design work is self-employment 1099, it can be hard to stay on top of the estimated tax payments. And you end up owing, yeah, I'm seeing some nods. You end up owing, you know, maybe 10, maybe 15, maybe even $20,000 to the IRS at the end of the year if you have a significant net profit on Schedule C. And then sometimes some penalties if you haven't paid into the system with quarterly estimated payments. in the worst case scenario, that turns into a downward spiral of owing the IRS more and more each year and not being able to dig out of the hole of IRS debt. So I guess the tip or the hope or the strategy is just to try to anticipate what your estimated what your tax liability will be for next year and pay into the system so that you don't get surprised by a significant tax liability. Of course, for 2020, who knows? I'm sure many of you have lost much work and maybe won't owe any taxes for 2020. We just don't know. And maybe the beginning of the year was great for you, so you will. The estimated tax deadlines also changed when the IRS changed the April 15th to July 15th deadline. So you have a little more time to catch up if you do owe estimated payments for 2020. But in terms of the kind of pandemic financial management, I would not prioritize paying the IRS if you have other immediate needs. So in other words, just wait and see what you might owe for 2020, assuming that you have lost work like most theater artists have. But in general, the trick of being fully self-employed or primarily self-employed is that tax liability, that 15.3%. Single owner LLC is a kind of entity that is quite simple, and you basically file the same form, Schedule C, that you would if you were self-employed and didn't have a single owner LLC or single member LLC, sometimes they're called. It just means that you have an EIN number and you might have a name that you're doing business as or that you use to identify your design work. Some people move towards an LLC for the liability protection, which is somewhat present when you have a single owner LLC, although it's not strong. It's basically saying if someone sues you for a breach of contract or some other reason, your personal assets might be protected by this LLC entity. And another reason you might want to choose that entity is because then you're handing out an EIN number instead of your social security number when you're working with clients. Partnership LLCs are, I would say, if you are in a long-term committed relationship with other artists or designers, you might want to consider a partnership LLC, which is very different in terms of the tax liability because the partnership files its own tax return, the 1065, and reports the income of the partnership and deducts the expenses of the partnership. What's left over is shared among the partners in relationship to their percentage of ownership. That shared percentage is reported to the IRS in the form of a K-1 that says, I, Amy Smith, had 25% of this partnership LLC's net profit, so I now pay self-employment tax on that portion of the LLC's net profit. An S-Corp is a corporate entity, a for-profit entity, that again, there was kind of a rush to incorporate after the new 2018 tax bill from he who shall not be named. And I think it was a little premature because a corporate filing is, or not necessarily premature, but like maybe unwise in some cases because a corporate tax form is more complicated, as is a partnership LLC form, frankly, than an individual or single member LLC form. So you have to budget in the time and money cost and filing cost of that and keep better financial records because you're going to be reporting more to the IRS and the taxing entities like your balance sheet. And then the most complicated entity is the 501c3, which I just want to destroy, having run one for 25 years, but also knowing the really problematic history of our 501c3 nonprofit industrial complex. But the reason that most people start a 501c3 is to be able to approach foundations for grant support, and many of them obviously require that you either have a 501c3 yourself or use a fiscal sponsor, which is a 501c3 to receive those funds. Another thing I just want to put into the world, into the room, is this idea that you could organize yourself, if you're with a group of people, as a worker cooperative, a worker-owned worker cooperative, under the entity of a partnership or a corporate entity. It varies state by state, and you set up a partnership or a corporation in the state that you reside in, or not necessarily, but usually. So look into the kind of legalities of that, but there are ways to set yourself up with a decision-making structure that more closely matches your values as a group, if that's something that you're interested in. And some organizations that are doing good work around this idea are USFWC, the US Federation of Worker Co-ops, and SELC, the Southern Economic Law Center, I think is what it stands for, SELC. Just encouraging folks to approach and consider worker co-op models, which I think will be the future of theater. Okay, moving away from scarcity mentality and setting up systems for long-term success and financial abundance. I love that topic. Thank you, Kate, for writing that. So I would say my advice or thoughts about that are that it's really important to learn to recognize the signs of scarcity mentality in yourself and others. Also this idea of imposter syndrome or imposter experience, because really it's usually imposed from without, this kind of nagging sense of like, I don't belong here, I shouldn't be here, I will soon be discovered as a fraud. Internalized undervaluation, which is something that we have received from the narratives and myths in our society that artists are and arts work is not valued in our society. It's perpetuated by unpaid internships. It's perpetuated by people paying us late or not paying us at all or asking us to work for free. So internalizing that undervaluation, and also recognizing the existing pay inequities that have been present for decades between genders and races, that we also internalize this sense of my time isn't worth enough or as much as. So seeing these in ourselves and being able to clearly see that this is neoliberal capitalism operating on us, infecting our brains so that neoliberal capitalism can extract wealth from you, the arts worker. And being able to move towards abundance, you can think of it as an act of rebellion or an act of self-care or an act of community care. I also just want to name that if you are like me, middle class or upper middle class, educate yourself about the class structure and your class identity and how you might even consider becoming a class traitor. There's some great organizations that are doing work around these questions, like Resource Generation, that has some really great models and ways of thinking about class and how we, again, kind of internalize a lot of messaging and myths about class. And the Highlander Center, where I took a workshop recently on becoming a class traitor. Really fabulous stuff there. Another kind of antidote to some of this mentality or some of this thinking, or helping us move towards abundance thinking post-pandemic, is to learn about collective and cooperative efforts and models and other kinds of solidarity economy efforts, many of which originated in Black communities and Indigenous communities, and many of which have been around for decades, centuries, millennia, like lending circles, like susus and tandas. So learning about those and trying to think about like how we as artists and in artist communities can utilize some of those existing resilience technologies for ourselves, in service of ourselves and in our close communities. And then after the immediate pandemic has passed, after we have a vaccine and we're not in as much health danger as we are right now, and in as much financial precarity as we are right now, consider moving towards longer term thinking, which feels impossible right now, I know, but longer term thinking, for example, setting up an emergency fund of 1 to 3 months worth of expenses. So if you're used to living off of $36,000 a year, that would be $3,000 to $9,000 worth of an emergency fund to be able to help you when the next crisis happens, whether it's a financial crisis or a global pandemic like the one we're in now. Thinking about retirement savings, which is often something that theater artists do not have and often don't think about until until we're in our 50s or 60s and it feels too late, or maybe it's never too late to set up a retirement savings, but if you're lucky enough to have 20 or 30 years to build retirement savings for yourself, to be able to think about that and to utilize compound interest to help those small amounts of saving each month grow into more substantial retirement savings for yourself over time. And other savings, long-term thinking. And then always prioritizing resource and knowledge sharing in spaces like this. So moments like this are just so precious to me because I just, put a lot of resources and information out into the room. I know that you all also have, together we know a lot, also have your own resources, and I would love for you to pop those into the chat if you know of other organizations that your fellow designers should know about that are doing debt counseling or credit management, or doing good work around indebtedness, or kind of intellectual work around class, like resource generation. Please share those with each other in this space and share them with me, because I'm also always building a knowledge base of resources. And yeah, I'll take questions, but I also just want to point people to my website where I have a resources page and a specific COVID-19 page where there are some COVID specific handouts and resources about valuing your time and how to prioritize spending in this moment, a profit and loss example spreadsheet and things like that.
Thank you, Amy. I think there are a couple of questions that came up, and I have a couple of questions as well, and then we'll just open it up. But from what you were talking about, I think this issue of 1099 versus W-2 is a big one, especially if we were working on a very large scale of different types of theaters and different capacities. So the question specific to New York State is that and I think this is true for all theaters, but if the producer or the theater is setting your schedule, is that something that would mean that you should be paid as a W-2 employee?
It's definitely one of the questions on the forum, and the New York State Department of Labor has actually been cracking down on mischaracterization a lot in recent years. It started, I knew about it because it was happening in the dance community. It probably also happened in the theater community as well. And basically what they were saying was dancers are employees. You tell a dancer to show up at 10 a.m. and rehearse all day and perform at 8, that's an employee. No one else can just jump in and do that job, et cetera, et cetera. So New York State has actually been, compared to many other states, kind of more on the cutting edge of cracking down on mischaracterization. And it is illegal. A lot of people feel fear about bringing it up with their employer, not wanting to get fired or be retaliated against. But it's just important to know that when you're being mischaracterized, If if you talk to them and they don't change the characterization to your liking, you can report them to the Department of Labor in your state. And a lot of times, especially in New York State, that'll have financial consequences for your employer. So just to be clear about that. And so, yeah, setting the schedule is one of the ways that characterization gets clarified, but it's not the only way. So again, it's a little bit, it's still a little bit in a gray area, but setting the theater setting your schedule would definitely push it towards being an employee.
Great. And then Zach on Facebook had a question about if you are hired as a 1099 employee and you are bringing your own equipment, should they be renting that from you specifically? Or if you're an employer, are they released of supplying all the materials to do the work? Like where does that fall? Because often, in my own personal experience, I have my computer with my various software licenses. I have, my equipment that I use for my shoots and so on and so forth. And I am, have had to learn over the years to be actually asking for a fee for literally everything.
Totally. Yeah, because if that theater had to buy QLab every time you designed it and you didn't already have it on your computer, it would cost them money. So you should charge them for using the QLab license that you purchased. Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a really I think that's a great thing to do. I guess it's part of the negotiation process when you're figuring out what the compensation is and what the reimbursable expenses are. And, just to be really clear, if you buy a piece of software for $1,000, but then you rent it to 5 theaters for $100 a pop, that means your reimbursable, your expense is now 500 instead of 1,000. Like if you're being reimbursed by theaters that you're working for, that reduces the amount that you can deduct on your own Schedule C or your own your own Schedule C.
We had a question from Stephanie asking if you could talk about the impact of declaring bankruptcy.
Yes, I'm certainly no expert on bankruptcy, and I haven't done it myself. But basically, it has a credit impact. It's not something that you would want to do right before buying a house. I mean, you couldn't really do it right before buying a house because a mortgage lender would not approve you for a mortgage if you showed a bankruptcy on your credit report from 6 months earlier or something like that. Or even in some cases, moving an apartment or buying a car, or it's definitely gonna mess with your credit for a couple years, a few years, maybe even a little bit longer. But it's not gonna mess with your credit forever. And yeah, again, it's not something to be taken lightly, but I think it's a really good solution. Unfortunately, student loan debt is not currently commonly dischargeable under bankruptcy. That I think is changing and should change, must change, because it's absurd that there's this category of debt that's carved out that way. But certainly if you have a lot of credit card debt or tax debt, it would, or even medical debt. Usually medical debt is the easiest to negotiate and often changes hands so that, a collection agency buys it for pennies on the dollar, and it's a little easier to navigate and negotiate. That said, of course, some folks have a lot of medical debt, so I don't want to minimize that. But if you have significant debt that's not student loan debt, and you've done your best to work it out and have not been able to, I just encourage you to consider bankruptcy.
Well, thank you, Amy. I'm going to pass it over to Dan.
Hello.
Hello.
I have a quick question for you. I'm hitting a point where I'm getting really close to paying off my student loans, so I'm starting to think about retirement savings. And I know you touched on it really briefly, but I'd like to know more about the different types of accounts, which ones you suggest, you know, all of the above, sort of how do you do it?
Yep. Okay, great. Thank you. So I guess I should also name that if you are employed by an employer, especially if it's a college or university, say, if you're teaching, oftentimes or sometimes the employer will have a 401k or 403b, it's called in the university world, that allows you to put money into retirement savings pre-tax. So that's always a good move if you can opt into a 401k or 403b. So that's the first thing I'll say about retirement savings. If you either don't have employment, you're all freelance or don't have access to a 401k or 403b, there's three kinds of individual retirement accounts or IRAs that you can look into. The one that I almost always recommend to artists is the Roth IRA, like Philip Roth, R-O-T-H. And the reason I recommend it is because the money grows tax-free, and when you take it out at retirement age, it's also tax-free. And it has kind of, it's easier to take out the principal. It's easier to take out your contributions before retirement age without penalty. So irs.gov can explain all of this. Like there are certain circumstances in which you can take money out of a retirement account without penalty. And the pandemic is one of them. So Roth IRA is usually the one I recommend the most. The traditional IRA is an IRA that gives you a tax benefit now. So if you are, if you have a high tax liability this year, or perhaps your spouse has is a high wage earner, or for whatever reason you owe a lot to the IRS and you want to reduce your tax liability today, the traditional IRA does that. It's not dollar for dollar, but if you contribute $6,000 to a traditional IRA, you might pay $3,000 less in taxes that year. And then the third kind is actually, designers is one of the few categories of folks that I would recommend this to a little more often than other kinds of artists, because oftentimes you have significant income, net profit and income on Schedule C. The SEP IRA, or self-employed person, I think it stands for, IRA, has a higher limit than the other two. You can put in more than $6,000 per year. It's calculated based on your income and net profit on Schedule C. So that can be a benefit. And it also helps reduce your tax liability now. So the Roth is better in general. The traditional and the SEP are better for near term. And then it's usually, we didn't talk about banks at all, but if you're already working with a local credit union or community bank, just ask them if they have an investment arm or some way of investing in a retirement account or starting a retirement account through them. And if not, there are loads of kind of easy virtual digital retirement savings options out there. And sometimes it costs $500 to get in or to start one, but a lot of times you can link them to your checking account and just pull 20 bucks a month or whatever. So the technology makes it really logistically easy to save for retirement over time.
Great. We just had a question pop up in the chat. So what about designers that are hiring assistants outside of fees that are delineated by the theater itself? Should we be concerned at all that this should fall under W-2 characterization under AB5, or is it more clearly contract work, given we can generally offer flexible hours and workplaces?
Yeah, again, it's such a gray area. And it's, as an individual, say you're receiving a 1099 from the theater, but you want to put your assistant on payroll. That's not impossible. Technology has made it easier and pretty inexpensive to use, like Gusto or one of these online payroll services, or even QuickBooks. QuickBooks has a payroll option as part of it, so that you're processing payroll for an employee, even though you yourself are not, you don't have an entity other than being yourself. So that's not out of the question, but it is uncommon in my experience. And I think that's usually because, like you say, that Kate, the conditions that that assistants and folks that are working with you and for you are under are often more flexible as to kind of schedule and who's doing the work and when they have to show up, then oftentimes the designer relationship to the theater. But that said, just a reminder, and I know you all already know this, but if you yourself pay an assistant more than $600 in a calendar year, you should be writing them a 1099 for their work for you, and then writing it off as contract labor on your Schedule C.
Yeah, I'm gonna use, Mike just posed a question in the chat that I'm gonna use to also pivot us a little bit more towards the framing of financial justice. You know, Mike was asking about saying, or that some companies will use this sort of scarcity idea that like putting people on payroll would bankrupt them. And that's why that they're paying people as W-2 employees. And I think that, you know, from the small to large companies, there's often this, you know, sense that there are not enough resources to adequately support the people, the artists that they're bringing in to do this work, which is actually what they're making profit, their whole profit on. I am curious if you have some thoughts about that, and like really, you know, is this keeping us in our place? Is this idea that you know, either not talking about money or not being able to value ourselves properly or not be paid properly is, like, in my experience, it feels as though that is really not benefiting the artists or the art. That is benefiting the producers. What do we do about that?
Yes. Oh, I have so much to say about this topic. Yeah, it's kind of, I feel the same way about someone, or the perception that somehow this 7.65% in payroll taxes is going to bankrupt the organization. I feel the same way about that I do about unpaid internships. It's like, if you can't afford to pay me 7.65% more, you shouldn't be hiring me in the first place. You know, it's like, if you need people to do the work of creating theater in your theater, clearly your budget must include the cost of labor, of people's time. So that 7.65 is just the cost of doing business. It's just the cost of having an employee. And I guarantee you that the office manager and executive director are on payroll, and the organization is paying the 7.65% for them to be on payroll. So they should be paying that for you. You know, the idea that somehow it'll bankrupt them is just absolutely absurd. And especially now, you know, there's just so many overlapping, messed up aspects of our unjust financial structures. One of them is the idea of health insurance being tied to employment. And it certainly used to be that, I remember back in the day when people would say, well, I can't afford to put them on payroll, because if I put them on payroll, I have to give them health insurance, and that costs too much. And, you know, as an employer myself for many years, I relate to that. That's not just 7.65% in addition to whatever you're offering to pay them in wages. That's, you know, $200, $300, $400, $500, $800 a month buying their health insurance for them because they're full-time. So that is a consideration. But so many of the rules about that, because of Obamacare, have been lessened. So it really isn't, that argument isn't sound anymore, that it's going to cost the employer more because they have to put you on payroll. There's so many exceptions to that rule. And the other costs are minimal, things like unemployment insurance that the employer pays, or, a tiny bit more in workers' comp or whatever. So I don't buy that argument. I call bullshit on that. And I think it's a way that employers perpetuate this undervaluation of artists' time unjustly.
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree with you. And I think that this idea about that it costs too much, and then, or just the cost of doing business in general, where often theaters are putting, I will see theaters putting so much money into things and so little money into people, when I'm offered this very tiny fee, and then my budget is much larger, or then it grows because of the need of the show. And so this disproportionate, this balance that is not actually, doesn't convey value of the human being,
Yes.
or the work that is being done.
And think about the impact on the land and our environment that has too, when you're spending $20,000 on a materials budget that are all, some theaters recycle their set materials or whatever, but there's the injustice, there's the economic injustice also wrapped up in that, or the environmental injustice also wrapped up in that. And this is, I'm sure many of you have read the Green New Theater work that Groundwater Arts is promoting, which talks about these kind of overlapping issues. And one of the things the Green New Theater document proposes is participatory community budgeting. So, I'll use the Wilma Theater as an example. I see Tom Weaver is on our call. So if the Wilma decided, our budget is whatever it is, $1 million a year, how are we going to split that up? How much goes to each production's set budget? How much goes to paying set designers and lighting designers and costume designers? Are costume designers paid less because that's a role that is usually women filling that role, and so we're gendering it and paying it less? How much goes to paying actors, and how much do they get a different rate when they're teaching artists versus actors, or a different rate when they're rehearsing versus performing? All of the kind of questions of justice and how money is spent. I would love to have a chance to take a look at that organizational budget and give my opinion as a community member that cares about the future of that theater. I will not have that opportunity unless I somehow sit on their board someday, which I wouldn't, but I would love to have that opportunity. And I think a lot of theaters should be moving towards participatory community budgeting.
Yeah, I think that has a lot to do with what Stephanie was just posting in the chat. This comment of how do we begin conversation towards our collaborators or folks in the positions of hiring designers about the cost of doing business and the current systems, and the argument that the systems are not sustainable, and so they don't make sense. I will bring up one of those systems right now that feels very relevant. I was participating in a conversation with D. Stu, or David Stewart, who's a production manager, formerly with the Guthrie, but now with Disney Theatrics, and Portia McGovern and Deb Savini and David Bengali. And we were talking about how an entire season's budget is decided before anybody is brought into the space. And the people in those rooms making the decisions about how the money is being spent are not the people actually spending the money or making the art. And so that structure is innately not working. So how do we reimagine these systems in a way that actually puts the resources where the resources need to be in the decision making, in the in the the place in the people's hands who are actually like need to be making those decisions.
Right, in the hands of those that are most impacted by those decisions. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, and there's so much. There's so much inequity or inequality in compensation between, a lot of these nonprofits. They're paying their. Oh, you can go to GuideStar and peek and see, the theater that's hiring you. How much are they paying their artistic director and executive director? I do that all the time when I'm negotiating with a organization that's trying to hire me to do something, even a small thing. Especially if they're trying to undermine me or get me to lower my rates for them. I'll just be like, oh, hey, well, you make $400,000 a year, so why are you trying to get me to lower my rate from $100 an hour to $80 an hour, whatever it is. So that's a really useful tool for just like knowing and noticing and lovingly calling in the fact that some people in our industry are making far more than a living wage and have a far more luxurious upper middle class lifestyle than many of the artists that are creating the work that is making their theater have the reputation that it has. This is such an important moment. And again, back to your opening slideshow and the We See You White American Theater movement, I think we are in a precious moment of, as devastating and the loss of life has been, and I don't want to minimize that because we are in a global pandemic and the loss of life has been horrifying. We are in a precious moment of pause where we can reimagine more and demand more equitable structures for our ecosystem. And we have to use people power. We have to use these kinds of convenings and unions, which I know many of you are in, and other ways of convening to be able to band together to demand living wages, to demand better access to health insurance, to demand more parent-friendly work environments, to demand more environmentally sustainable theaters, to demand pay equity or equal pay, or even pay that recognizes the historic disparities between white men, white women, women of color, etc. We can demand those things. And I think we should demand those things so that when theaters reopen, we are reopening in a more healthy, sustainable way.
Yeah, I do. Also, I should let everyone know you all feel free. You have the ability to unmute yourselves. If anything comes up, please do, take the opportunity. But Amy, I really love how you frame so much of your work and mission around financial justice. And as you were saying, and you kind of answered a big part of my question in what you just said, but in this time that we're in, where there is this reckoning in the world and specifically inside of our field of theater and the theater industrial complex, in like your dream world, what are some of the ways forward? What are some of the things that we leave behind? And what are some of the practices we take forward from here that will actually help like tangibly work towards, financial justice?
Oh, I love that question so much. I think it starts with the generation of young people that will be artists soon, as we leave the field, and creating theater education environments that are healthy and inclusive and don't saddle young theater artists with unmanageable debt burden. I imagine theaters that have different models other than 501c3. I mentioned worker co-ops, and I can imagine theaters moving away from 501c3, which, because of its structure, engenders a kind of hierarchical decision-making and perpetuates a lot of white supremacy culture that we all know is so present in most theater organizations. So imagine a theater ecosystem full of worker-owned, worker co-ops, where actors and ensembles are making decisions and designers are making decisions about how the budget gets spent. I imagine more theaters and arts organizations where compensation is, where there's a values-led decision-making process about how people are compensated and what the differentials are between different arts workers' compensation. I guess I just sound like a straight up socialist right now, but I don't think anyone should be making $500,000 when someone else is making $20,000. I think that's immoral and wrong. I imagine an end to unpaid internships. I don't think anyone's work should be uncompensated. And I imagine theater or workplaces being healthier environments for artists of color, Black and Indigenous folks. I don't think we will have anytime soon, we will have, safe spaces or racism-free spaces, but we must move in an anti-racism direction, and we must attempt to create healthier conditions and healthier environments so that all artists can thrive and do good work inside our organizations. And I guess the one piece I left out of that was foundations and the giving class, the philanthropic models that we are living under right now, which are most of our philanthropic foundations come from family wealth that came from extractive industries. And foundations have done to date mostly a terrible job of responding to, even when grantmakers in the arts rings the alarm bell in 2015 and says, hey, we need to respond to racial inequities in funding, they still have mostly done nothing. And even now in the Black Lives Matter uprising, they're still mostly doing nothing. So foundations also need to evolve and be reformed, which would be part of removing 501c3 from our ecosystem. So really what I want is systems change. That's what I dream of.
We have a Facebook question about what advice would you give to young artists who are just graduating and came into this field in this landscape right now, or early career artists who have a less of a foothold trying to figure out how to weather the storm of this current moment?
Oh, that's such a tough time to have just graduated from college. My niece who's living with us right now just graduated from college, and it's just really tough. Maybe one piece of advice I would give is something that I've been telling myself lately after being in the field for 25 plus years, which is try to find and work with people and organizations that you are values aligned with, like seek out those spaces, places, people, because there really is no climbing a ladder of success or financial success right now anyway. So you might as well use this opportunity in this moment to try to find your values people, the people who you feel aligned with. Take advantage of all of the possible ways that this pandemic is offering, things like unemployment compensation, SBA loans, just do what you can to feel empowered to access those, some people call them stimulus, but they're not stimulus, they're relief funds or those government relief efforts. And spend some energy in this moment of pause, like setting up kind of systems for yourself, setting up like, how are you going to track your financial, how are you going to track your income and your expenses? How are you going to decide on an entity type? How are you going to kind of build your outward facing relationship to the world, whether it's a website or whatever? Spend some time in kind of self-reflection and utilize this moment to get clearer about what you hope for as an artist. And don't pay your student loans.
Right now, yeah.
Wait for President Bernie Sanders, President AOC, and then they'll just go away.
I totally missed Amy's question earlier, which so perfectly tied into what you were saying about cooperatives. Could you just touch on what the major benefit for worker co-op is?
Yeah, worker co-ops, and I don't have a lot of like knowledge of how this will operate in the arts community, because it's most worker co-ops that I'm aware of are like food co-ops is a model that most people are familiar with, or even like there's a bookkeeping co-op I got in touch with recently, like folks that are doing fee for service or banding together and pooling resources. And really it's about the decision-making structure. It's about one person, one vote. So if you are a member of a cooperative structure, or you're a worker-owned organization, you have more decision-making power. You do actually get to decide how much fee the designer should get for each production, versus that being a board decision or the executive director's decision. So that's how I'm imagining it operating in the kind of arts and theater landscape.
Great.
And yes, they require substantial group communication and work. Like anything that's about community building, it takes more time. You have to intentionally create that time and create that self-reflection and that, that reflection time.
Communication. I just, we have about 5 minutes left before we just open up the space. But I would love to go back to what you were just talking about, this, putting the money where the mission is, looking for organizations that share the same values. And a lot of the time you can see that in where people are spending and where organizations are actually spending their money. And, one of the things that is very lacking inside that of our industry, at least as designers, that there is very little pay transparency and budget transparency. You did just mention that you can actually go online and look up artistic directors' salaries, which I have never even thought to do, which seems very obvious now. But not often, but there are some people that try to send contracts out that have these non-disclosure agreements inside of them. So you don't speak to your colleagues about how much you're getting paid. And so what would fee and budget transparency actually do for this industry, and where, in the capitalist, world that we live in, how do we dismantle some of those structures to give the power back to the people actually doing the work?
I love that question. So I want to name wageforwork.com, which really came out of the visual arts world, kind of experimental visual arts world. It started as a kind of radical proposal about fee transparency, and it started, I think, because artists were saying, hey, you got $5,000 to do your thing at the Guggenheim, I got 10 grand for that same gig. And the person who got $5,000 was like, what? You got 10 grand? I'm going to go back and negotiate for a higher fee from them. So just sharing information about how much people were getting paid for various gigs is so powerful. And then Wage can give and does give, if you go to their website, a thumbs up to organizations that pay artists well and a thumbs down to organizations that don't. But yeah, the radical, I mean, it shouldn't be radical, but it is, idea of like, if you have to be secretive because you're either paying some people so poorly or paying other people so well that you're embarrassed to share that, I feel like that tells you everything you need to know about an organization. So yeah, I think we can all do more advocating for budget transparency and pay transparency. After learning about an arts organization in Providence, Rhode Island called AS220, which has a pay equity, equal pay policy, that got me thinking about my own arts organization. Their thinking is everyone in our arts organization does important work, from the executive director to the janitor. And so everyone should get paid the same amount. And I think that amount is something like $40,000 or $45,000 a year. So when you sign up to work for AS220, you know that's what the pay is, and you know you're getting paid the same as everyone else in the organization. And I thought that was kind of a radical idea. I sort of adopted it or adapted it to the arts organization I was running at the time. And that felt really good. What that doesn't do is acknowledge the disparities, the historical disparities that have existed and do exist for different categories of folks. So maybe there's some adjustment that needs to happen there as far as a really radical way of thinking about pay and pay transparency. But again, it goes back to this idea of participation and participatory budgeting and the people who are most impacted by the decision making to be involved in the decision making process. And that is radical and important and will change the field.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much, Amy, for joining us to talk about all things money. I would just invite everybody that is here to turn on your cameras before I stop us from streaming, just to say thank you. This is not the end of talking about money and how to like rework this whole system in this opportunity this time. So thank you to everybody that is doing the work. Thank you to Amy for gifting us with your time and your knowledge and in the space of mutual learning and uplifting each other. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. Take care, everyone.